That willful blindness and woeful underpreparedness is basically leaving our future generations asking, WTF?
We're going to talk about the very difficult task of embodying the future in the present, and the difficulties that democracies face, which are significant, with tackling long-term problems. It's always been a difficulty democracies have faced. How do you do something, the consequences of which will be only fulfilled many years hence, perhaps decades hence, in the present? It's a genuine problem, and most democracies don't tackle it particularly well. And we will explore some of the ways in which that happens or doesn't happen, what we might do about it, how we might do it better. I've got with me three people who I think are up to that very difficult task I've just set. Hilary Greaves is a professor of philosophy at the University of Oxford and a trailblazer in the field of effective altruism. And Hilary was the founding director of the Global Priorities Institute. I have Lord Jonathan Sumption with me. He's an author, political commentator, and most decorated lawyer of his generation. And Jonathan sat as a judge on the Supreme Court between 2012 and 2018 and appeared as a barrister for many, many things, one of which was a Hutton inquiry. And Sophie Howe is a Sustainable Futures and Wellbeing Advisor who has a great distinction of being the very first person to hold the role of Future Generations Commissioner in Wales. So an attempt to embody in policy the claims of future generations. So let me open up by coming to Hilary for opening remarks.
Thank you. Okay, so if the question we want to ask is something like, to what extent should current policy be guided by considerations of the far future, whereby the far future we might mean consequences of current policy that only come to pass, say, more than 100 years from now, I think there are two really quite distinct sets of issues that we face, and it's helpful to start by separating those. The two sets of issues I'm thinking of separating are the ethical principles and the empirical issues. So the ethical questions will be things like, to what extent do further future people matter morally for the purpose of current decision making? What responsibilities do we owe to future people? To what extent can we permissibly be partial towards the present generation? The empirical issues are to do with the challenges of predicting and affecting the further future. So one line of thought in the empirical bucket goes something like, oh, but come on, it's so basically impossible to predict what the effects of anything we do now will be on timescales of centuries, that the whole project of trying to make current policy with an eye to the further future is completely hopeless. So those are the empirical challenges. Having separated those two things, I guess I'll use the remainder of my 3 minutes by trying to say a little bit more about the ethical ones, my own expertise being as a moral philosopher. Derek Parfit, one of the most renowned moral philosophers of the 20th century, invites us to consider the following thought experiment. Suppose that you are out in the forest on a walk one day and you accidentally break a glass bottle. Suppose, hopefully nobody here would do this, suppose that you decide to bury this glass bottle in a shallow bottle grave, knowing that sometime in the future a child playing in the forest will be injured, will cut themselves on this glass. Parfit then asked us to consider whether it makes a difference to the morality of that action, whether the child in question is going to find the bottle tomorrow or instead in 1,000 years' time. The point of this thought experiment is supposed to bring out the thought that if you really could be equally certain that a child would be harmed in 1,000 years, as you could be that a child would be harmed in exactly the same way tomorrow, there is no morally relevant difference between those two cases. If you agree with that intuition, then you think, okay, in principle, further future people matter ethically to just the same extent that present people do. The issues, if we're thinking that maybe current policy should be mostly focused on the nearer future, can only be along the more empirical side. Maybe we are just, in fact, completely, hopelessly uncertain what children will be up to, whether they will still be playing in forests in 1,000 years' time, whereas we might have very good grounds for thinking that that's going to happen tomorrow. Maybe I'll flag one more thing that I think sometimes gets people hung up and then perhaps going in a wrong direction on the ethical issues. Sometimes people are gripped by the thought that, well, but hang on, this stuff about caring about future people who haven't even been born yet, doesn't make sense because those future people don't exist. It doesn't make sense to care about people who don't exist. I think this is just a confusing way of using the word exist. It might be helpful to think of time on an analogy with space. You can picture the universe as a four-dimensional block. There are the familiar three dimensions, the three dimensions of space. Time is just the fourth dimension. So when we're talking about a person who will exist in 1,000 years' time, you can rephrase that as thinking about a person who does exist in this four-dimensional block, just located somewhere different from us. So on that way of thinking, talking about the morality of affecting far future people is a very similar set of issues to talking about the morality of affecting people who are far away from us in space. Okay, maybe I'll stop there.
Well, Hilary, thank you. I mean, you set out a very interesting way in which the ethical demands will lead us to have empirical answers to the questions of how we respond. Jonathan Sumption, what's your opening thoughts on this dialogue between the short and the long term?
Well, I think it's at the same time very simple and very difficult. Obviously, we have a moral responsibility to future generations. We live in society, and by definition, that means that we have duties to entities which are larger than ourselves. Family, nation, humanity, these are all entities with a future longer than our own. But that's the easy bit. Because this is a practical and not just a moral issue, and I agree with the point that's just been made about there being two buckets. First of all, we have to recognize our limitations. We cannot know what will be in the interest of people more than a short time ahead. A generation, maybe 2 or 3 generations, probably not more, except in the simplest of cases, like broken glass bottles. The perceptions and priorities of our grandchildren will depend on intervening technological developments and on changing moral priorities, many of which we simply will not be able to anticipate. History is actually full of blueprints for the future, all of which have only one thing in common: they all turned out to be wrong. Now, secondly, looking at the practical side, democracy is also, to a large extent, a moral principle. And the future has no votes. Future generations are not part of the existing polity. That doesn't mean to say that we are justified in ignoring their interests, but it is a real practical issue. Climate change is the obvious test issue, and much the most important one. Most policy options for dealing with climate change involve higher costs or reduced consumption, or a mixture of the two. Democratic electorates are not going to accept readily either of those things unless they are introduced gradually, persuasively, tactfully. People living in the country, many of them in old houses, are not going to agree to measures that will cost them £20,000 up front for new heating systems that still leave them shivering. People who depend on their cars to get to work because of lifestyle choices made often decades ago, or to take their children to school, just can't be told to wise up and buy a different car, or none at all. As the Mayor of London is now discovering, sanctimonious hectoring about the imminent end of the world is not likely to change these basic human instincts about our fellow citizens. You will not persuade people to agree with you by disruptive demonstrations designed to make their lives a misery. So unless we abandon democracy in favor of some form of authoritarian government, we have to compromise between our own interests and those of our grandchildren.
Jonathan, thank you. It's interesting, isn't it, how a long-term question comes all the way down to the Uxbridge by-election. This is part of modern politics immediately.
It's a symptom of something much larger.
Yeah, absolutely. Sophie?
Well, our systems of politics and governance are inherently short-term, and there's very little interest really in trying to change that. It's a bit like turkeys voting for Christmas, really. And I think that is one of the biggest challenges that we face, and is why we're in this kind of existential threat, particularly around climate change. Not just climate, however, some of our ways of life, some of the things that we hold very dear are really at significant risk because of our failure to think long term. So institutions like the National Health Service, the way in which that is absolutely creaking under the pressure, the way in which everything is directed just in the short term at chucking more money at the problem, not enough money, to deal with the waiting list and not actually getting up front of any of those issues, asking the question, why are people on waiting lists in the first place? What are the holistic, long-term public policy solutions that we might want to put in place to deal with some of that? And actually, if we thought long-term and if we thought joined up, transport policy is a public health policy, because actually if you think about transport policy as delivered in a way which reduces air pollution, which encourages people to use public transport, active travel, walking and cycling, which encourages communities to be more connected in those ways. Those are all factors which are the wider, longer term determinants of health. So I don't think you can split these things up. But governments and policymakers are inherently really bad at doing that. And I think that there are some particular issues there. I think that government and policymakers are willfully blind to issues, the wicked issues that they don't want to deal with. We have put more, and we can say, okay, go in 100, 200, 1,000 years into the future, we don't know. And you're right to a degree, Michael, futurists don't often get things exactly right. I was looking at some predictions from 1923 for the year 2023 a little while ago, and some of the headlines there were things like, we should worry because women will be shaving their heads and men will be wearing curls. Also, they were saying that we would all now in 2023 only be working a 4-hour day owing to the work of electricity. And they also said that we would all be using utensils made from pulp, and humans would be living at least to 100 years and in some cases up to 200 years. Now, that's not exactly right, but you can see some of those signals there, the way in which we have a completely different view of gender and identity, for example. The world's biggest trial of a reduced working week has just been completed successfully. We are all living longer, not quite to 200 years yet, and actually plateauing life expectancy at a UK level, and perhaps we're ending our love affair with plastic. So there are some signals there, but I think the key issue is we don't even bother to look for those signals. And beyond not even looking for those signals, we are willfully blind to the absolute blatant evidence which is in front of us. So we have put more carbon into our atmosphere since the UN published their first framework of evidence on climate change, since Al Gore published his first Inconvenient Truth. We have willfully done more damage since that time. We are woefully unprepared for the steps that we now need to take. So yes, we are in a position where people are balking at, I'm used to driving my car, I can't afford a heat pump and so on. But that is because of the woeful inadequacy of public policy to have actually got up front of those issues 10, 15, 20 years ago. And so that willful blindness and woeful underpreparedness is basically leaving our future generations asking, WTF?
For podcasts, talks, debates, courses and articles, visit the Institute of Art and Ideas. Click the link on screen now to iai.tv.